Well, all right, let's go ahead and get started and folks can catch up. Good morning, I guess, for everybody. I'm Kim Coble. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland League of Conservation Voters, and I am very pleased to be joined today by Wes Moore, the gubernatorial candidate that the Maryland League of Conservation Voters has endorsed. So good morning, Wes, and thank you for joining us.
It is my joy. My joy. Thank you.
Wes and I had a chance to last week be together where he laid out his first 100-day plan for climate. And I was very impressed with what was said. And I thought it was really important that our members and voters and conservationists hear directly from him. He jumped at the opportunity to share his thoughts today with us. And so again, I'm deeply grateful for him. We have thank you, Kristen. If I'm going to ask him some questions, and then at the end of the end of my questions, we'll open it up, and I will. You can submit questions via the chat, and I'll read those, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can in the half hour that we have today. So let me introduce Wes Moore. He's a combat veteran. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He's a best-selling author, a small business owner. And between 2017 and 2021, Wes served as a CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation, a charitable organization which attempts to alleviate poverty, problems caused by poverty in New York City. Wes and his wife, Dawn, live with their 2 children in Baltimore City. And as I said, he has received the endorsement of Maryland LCV. So good morning, Wes, and thanks for joining us.
Good morning. It's such a joy to be with you. It really is, and thank you.
So we know that you have a very ambitious 4-year and 8-year plan with many things for environmental agenda. But as I said, last week, you unrolled a plan for the first 100 days. And if folks are interested, you can get information on that plan on both Wes's website and Maryland LCV's website. Tell us a little bit about how you came up with the plan for the first 100 days and what approach you took in developing it.
Yes, thank you. And first, sincerely to you, Kim, and to Maryland LCV, thank you. I cannot tell you enough, not just how much your endorsement means, but also just how much your partnership means, because we will be working closely together to actualize and make sure that Maryland is going to be the environmental leader that we need to be. And you truly are one of my heroes in this work. And so I just want to say thank you so much for this and for everything. And and I was very excited to be able to work with many of you on this plan. And it was both about the what, which I'll get into in a second, into the what, but it was also the why. Like, why was this so important? Because it's interesting that when I'm talking to Marylanders, I will consistently share what I think are some of the top issues that the next governor has got to be able to address over this next decade, to be able to make our, to truly move our state forward. That our state needs to be more competitive while also being more equitable, that we have to close the racial wealth gap, and we have to fight climate change and deal with the issue of the environment. And people will often say to me, they're like, well, we know you've worked on a lot of issues of poverty and education. We're interested that climate makes its way in your top 3 issues that we've got to address. And they're like, why is that? And my answer is really actually pretty simple. It's because climate change affects every aspect of our lives, every single one. And it shows itself in every single way. And the other thing is, it shows itself disproportionately because it impacts disinvested communities and communities of color hardest. Where I think about, here in Baltimore, I'm a very proud Baltimorean. And I know that here in Baltimore, our children suffer from asthma at rates as twice as high as anywhere else in the state. And that's not because Baltimore's children have weaker lungs, right? That I'm passionate about this issue because, we're thinking about the different ways and mechanisms that we are going to be able to move head on and aggressively on this issue. When you consider the fact that the climate change and climate has cost Maryland over $10 billion over the past decade. So this is not just an environmental issue, it's an economic issue that our state is likely to see nearly $20 billion in real estate damage alone. By 2050, 25% of all homes in the Eastern Shore could be completely underwater. And so our ability to be able to move now, move aggressively on these issues is just going to be absolutely, absolutely imperative. And so the chance to work with you and truly, and to work with you as we fight climate change is going to be imperative. Now, there are certain things that we are going to do in those first 100 days that we're going to not just think of it being incredibly important for us to move on measurements of who is going to be in which seats, how are we going to use executive orders, but then also helping to set the tone for the type of things that we need to be able to do. The first is we have to ensure that we have accountability at the highest levels of government. And that includes, my promise that in that first 100 days, we will be announcing the appointment of a Chief Sustainability, Mitigation, and Resilience Officer. First time in the state's history. This person will report directly to me, and they will oversee the implementation of the state's climate plan, because we need someone who is going to be working across agencies and across departments. I do not view this issue as a lane, as a lane. I view this issue as a lens, and the person who's responsible for that is going to help to mitigate that, working with every sector of our society. That we are going to begin the transition to 100% clean energy and build a clean energy workforce. I'm proud of what the legislature accomplished with the Climate Solutions Act. And I'm proud of what they got done, specifically considering the fact that we had a governor who was not a partner with them to get that done. Now that they are going to have a governor who is very clearly going to be a partner and require that Maryland is, 100% energy is produced by clean sources by 2035, that we can be, net zero emissions by 2045, is imagine what we can do if they actually have a partner, have a governor who's willing to be a partner in this work. And that we're also going to be able to move and work collectively to be able to address these issues. That we are going to hire additional climate change staff by calling on the Maryland Department of Budget Management to actually approve and prioritize funding for the positions with positions in MDE, because we need to implement the Climate Solutions Now Act, and we have to make sure that we have the resources to be able to get that done. That we are going to develop partnerships with Maryland institutions to more effectively hit targets, and that includes our colleges, universities, our HBCUs. That we're going to prioritize environmental justice funding to underserved and overburdened communities. Where we know that we're setting aside state funds to address these local needs, and we have to be able to invest in transit, directing agencies to apply a Justice 40 lens in concert with the federal government as they actually begin to think about budgetary decisions. And we have to do things like aggressively protect the Chesapeake Bay and improve Maryland's water quality. And that means increasing staffing agencies. That means, being able to develop a plan to accelerate projects and practices that improve water quality and sequester carbon, like pursuing, forested buffers, working with our agriculture and our forestry industry, working across sectors. Because when we're looking at some of the issues that we continue to see, some of the reports, which frankly should be keeping all of us up at night. Recent reports that are showing, the levels of crabs and oysters and rockfish that we have in the bay, and the damage that's being done. That's not just has health implications, but it has very significant economic implications as well. So these are all things that in the first 100 days we are going to move on, not just because we have to, but also because it's going to help to set the tone for how our administration is going to think about this issue and the work that we've got to get done together for the next decade for the state.
Thank you, Wes. And I do encourage folks to really read the plan, the first 100-day plan on climate. It shows a very thoughtful, comprehensive approach. It also speaks very loudly to an understanding of the urgency that's in front of us with this problem. So I encourage folks to look at that. Let me turn to transportation. Transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions nationwide, and that includes in Maryland. And you do have elements of this in your 100-day plan. So let me have you talk about transportation emissions, the reduction plan, how you're applying an equity lens to that proposal, et cetera.
Yes, and I'm very, very excited about the transportation assets and the transportation planning that we have. for in the first 100 days. It also highlights the fact how excited I am to have Delegate Aruna Miller as my running mate. Delegate Aruna Miller, for those who don't know, is a seasoned and a deeply respected legislator out of Montgomery County. She calls it from the Fighting 15th. Where she represented District 15, but also she was on the Ways and Means and the Appropriations Committee. She is a transportation and a civil engineer by training, having worked in the executive branch in Montgomery County on those issues. And I am absolutely thrilled to not just partner with her, but to know that we are going to have a very aggressive transportation plan, mass transportation plan, as to how we're helping Marylanders move and maneuver, and transportation is going to be a very, very core and important part of that, particularly when you consider the fact that transportation, particularly we're looking at cars, is the highest single source of greenhouse gas emissions that we have within our state. We have got to find ways of increasing mass transit options, of being able to incentivize not just electric vehicles, but giving people additional options besides having more cars, having cars on the road. It's the single most important thing that we can do to be able to help address the issue of greenhouse gas emissions. And so when I think about what that means and what these transportation emissions have cost, I mean, they are incredibly, incredibly dangerous. And according to a recent study, they've cost more than 600 Marylanders their lives each year. And so as we fight to reduce climate, transportation emissions has got to be a core part and will be a core part of what our focus is and how we're planning on doing that. Our administration is going to set aggressive goals to transition to net zero emissions by 2045, invest in public transit and incentivize Marylanders to be able to move towards electric vehicles, being able to electrify the grid. And I think there's a few different ways that I will look at every single transportation project that comes up to our desk. One, it's through the lens of equity. And what I mean by that, it's both who's building it and who can benefit from it. The second piece is how we're looking at it from a lens of the environment. And what are the environmental implications of every single transportation project that is then brought up in front of us? And the third piece is going to be through a lens of community engagement and community involvement. Has the community been involved in that? Has the community's voice been heard? Both local elected officials, but also the community groups and organizations. Have they had their voices heard in that? Because I think those are all really important things to talk about ways we're going to move and have greater transportation assets that we have on board. And, as I said publicly, and that includes things like, right now in the DC suburbs, we've got a bunch of empty tunnels called the Purple Line. In the Baltimore region, we have a bunch of dreams deferred called the Red Line. We have mass transportation options and plans that significantly could increase economic growth, significantly could help to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, but that have been just massively mismanaged. And that's something that I think our team and our administration, in partnership with LCV and others, will uniquely be able to address.
Excellent, thank you. Sticking with transportation, this is a really important issue for the conservation community writ large, and that is Highway 270. And can you give us a sense of your position on the widening of Highway 270?
Yeah, I'm against the current plan that the governor's proposed, but I also think it's important to explain why. I recognize the need to address the unbearable traffic congestion and the infrastructure issues around 270 and the American Legion Bridge. And I do know that over the next decade, we've got to find ways of being able to fix the American Legion Bridge. It's unsustainable. So I understand all of those points. But I also do want to be very clear that I do not support the current plan as proposed by the Hogan administration. And I also do not support the toll lanes as proposed in the current P3 plan. I believe that there are substantial environmental justice issues that must be addressed, and I think there's certain assets and facets of the plan that actually initially were even incorporated that have now since been removed, which I deem to be very, very problematic. One is I think there are plans, and I think there's ways to talk about ways you can use the current footprint without talking about road widening, about how are you thinking about the uses of shoulders, reversible lanes, et cetera. There are creative things that actually can be done that have not been put into the current plan, which I think needs to be revisited. The second thing is how we're looking at mass transit options involved in it as well. If you look at some of the original plans, there were mass transit options that actually flowed within the ways we're talking about 270, have since been removed, and I think is an important facet to be thought through as we're talking about what is the future of 270 Beltway, what is the future, what's actually going to look like, and something I think needs to be reincorporated into that conversation. The plan, shelved decades of planning and input from communities, and a process that is frankly has led to a lack of transparency that people have and a lack of trust that you have from the community. And there is one thing that I do know as a chief executive, you are going to make decisions that not everybody is going to like. I understand that, but at least people need to feel like they are being heard. At least people need to feel like their point of view has been understood. And if you look at the current plan in place right now, that has not been in place. And so when you're thinking about the lens that I laid out before, equity, who's building it, who can benefit from it, the environmental impacts, and the community and strong community input, this plan that's currently proposed does not check off on any of those things. And so that's where I stand, where we have to address the issue of the congestion. We have to address the issue of the American Legion Bridge, but we need to do it thoughtfully. And that's something that our administration is going to push in and make sure we get done.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. I know that's on a lot of people's minds. Let me jump ahead a little bit to, you mentioned the input and the really paying attention to what citizens are saying and what concerned citizens are saying. I know you're traveling all over the state and you're hearing from many different people. My question for you is, how are you getting information from communities? And how are you finding out about the solutions in which they're looking to put forward and where they live? A great example is with the offshore wind. Yeah. Lots and lots of supporters of it, and there are definitely some hot pockets of opposition. So yes. As you travel, what are you hearing? How are you listening to it? And how are solutions getting built?
Yeah, I love this question, Kim, because it really goes back to the way that I have always led. I used to have a sign on my desk that said, the people who are closest to the challenge are the ones closest to the solutions. Mm. They were just hardly ever at the table. And so I think about where the best thing that we all can do as leaders is making sure that you are doing everything you can do to keep your ears close to the ground on things. And so I know that as we're moving towards a clean energy future, we must build wind and solar energy, production capacity. We must make critical investments in research to develop battery storage, because for all these things to be real, we have to increase our capacity for the battery storage. And we're going to do that by being able to bring various stakeholders to the table and working together to actually address the community level concerns while remain focused on our goals. I tell you, I think, the red line was actually a really important example where I thought the decision around the red line was disqualifiable that the governor made. And it wasn't just the decision, it was how the decision was made, where even if people had disagreements about where should the line stop or that type of thing, all fair points, right? But what leadership is, then you bring everyone back around the table. You're very clear that this is something that needs to get done because the community needs it. And then say, okay, now let's talk through all the details of the plan. But instead, what happened was we literally had close to $1 billion that were returned to the federal government as if the communities did not need that. That decision and the decision-making processes were essentially disqualifiable. And I think about the way that I've always led, whether it was, when we had an administration in Washington that was literally locking children up and putting them in cages just depending on their immigration status, We worked across sectors, private sector, nonprofit sector, philanthropy, and built, the organization that I led built this platform called the Immigrant Justice Corps. And during our time and our tenure, we helped to scale it out across the country to ensure that every single child had a right to counsel, regardless of immigration status, because until that point, we had 3-year-olds who were defending themselves in immigration court. When we said we need to address the racial wealth gap, we built a platform called 90 to 0, where we work with everyone from the CEO of Goldman Sachs to the head of the NAACP, from the CEO of Starbucks to the head of the ACLU, and said, how do we address an issue that is collectively impacting all of us, knowing which specific assets we bring to the table? That is something this current administration has simply failed to do, and it's something that we are going to level set when it comes to our administration. And so being able to work with community groups, being able to work with advocacy organizations, being able to make sure that everyone is going to have a seat around that table, being able to work with the private sector, to be able to get private dollars off of the sidelines, and being able to leverage the work that we all need to collectively do. It's something that I think about the work of myself and Aruna, that's been our life work. And frankly, the framework on how we've been able to get big things done. And that's exactly the kind of leadership that I plan on bringing to Annapolis as well.
Awesome. And before I get to the fun question, let me ask you one more detailed question. And I saw this come up in the chat as well. The programs you're talking about are not cheap. It's expensive to change the grid. It's expensive to put offshore wind in. It's expensive to change communities. It's expensive to bring people together sometimes. Yeah. So talk to us about how you anticipate the funding mechanisms working for climate change improvements.
Yeah, and I love that question, because it's also really important to remember that it's also really expensive not to do it, right? It's incredibly expensive for the state to continue to pay for the fact that we do not have resilient infrastructure. It's incredibly expensive for the state to continue to pay for the fact that we literally still have 21st century, we don't have 21st century schools, and children who, when it hits 90 degrees, have to leave school because they don't have proper air conditioning, because we have rising sea levels and we don't have seawalls that are able to accommodate. Inaction is incredibly expensive. Now, the good thing about this moment, though, is we actually have a pretty unique moment when it comes to pay-fors. We have a generational opportunity when it comes to pay-fors inside of this state. Not to mention the fact that the state has about a $7.2 billion structural surplus, right? Something that the state was not anticipating, but this is the situation we do find ourselves in. But we also have new platforms and examples of things that Maryland can actually compete for. So we've got $4.6 billion in EV infrastructure that the state can compete for, about over $15 billion in a bridge investment program. 16 billion dollars for mega projects that will deliver substantial economic benefits to communities. $6 billion, in a new funding program for Safe Streets for All. So we have new capital that actually is on board. Not to mention the fact that, I'm very proud that when I was you mentioned that I was a Rhodes Scholar. When I was there, I got a chance to first meet a guy named Pete, who now goes by Secretary Buttigieg, who I'm very excited to be able to work and partner with as a Secretary of Transportation. And to say that there are real significant assets on the transportation side that Maryland, if we choose to compete for, we have on board to be able to make these investments, leveraging federal dollars, leveraging private dollars, where we have literally looking at ESG budget, well, the trillions of dollars in the private sector, that we can come up with unique ways of being able to partner and actually create mechanisms of long-term infrastructure for our state. And so they are expensive. But the thing I would ask people is this, remind people is that inaction is very expensive. And we have generational and unique generational resources to be able to deal with these issues. And these are all things that myself and Aruna Miller plan on leveraging in order to get done on behalf of the people of Maryland.
Thank you. We've got lots and lots of good questions here. And I'm trying to skim through these real quickly, but there's a couple folks that are asking specifically around the transportation and electric vehicles and incentives for purchasing electric vehicles, and the infrastructure it takes to support electric vehicles. So I know that this is mentioned in your plan. If you can kind of do a little bit of a highlight on that, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for that question too. And you are right. It's a part of our plan that we talk in detail about. And so I do encourage people to go and spend time and take a look at it. But you are right. I mean, when we talk about things like we are going to have a 100% electric fleet of state vehicles for the state of Maryland. We understand that's ambitious and we understand that's aggressive, but we also know it can be done. And that needs to be done for a few different reasons. One is I think it's going to help to set the tone and set an example for the type of things that we want to be able to do and we want to be able to get done. But also, it's important that the state take that real measurement of leadership, looking at what it means for our state fleet to be able to drive that. Now, the thing that we do know is that we can and we will provide incentives, but we've got to also address the costs of EVs and provide how those incentives are going to, how those incentives are going to be best leveraged. But also, it is about making sure that we're going to focus on things like the electrification of the grid. And the electrification of the grid is going to be important because, for us to be able to manage the type of need and the type of pull that's going to happen, that electrification of the grid has got to be accelerated. There's a few things that the state can uniquely do to be able to address that. One is when you're looking at the infrastructure that we have in place right now, for us to be able to put a greater level of resources and attention and connectivity between that grid and the consumption that we're going to be that is necessary has to be actually thoroughly thought through and invested in. But there is capital coming from the federal government that's specifically earmarked towards that exact thing. The second piece that I do think becomes important is how are we going to leverage this remarkable higher education ecosystem that we have within the state of Maryland. And that goes for both the electrification of the grid and for electric vehicles. That goes towards solar and wind technologies as well, where we have some of the top institutions of higher education in the country here in the state of Maryland. We have 4 of the top HBCUs in America here in the state of Maryland. And you go just outside our borders, just then let's go on and throw on Howard University as a fifth. But we as a state have to be very clear and transparent with our institutions of higher education about what are the incentives that we're providing to them to be able to ensure that the intellectual capital they are producing are being actually focused and pathways are being created for people to be able to focus on these issues of the electrification of the grid, creating new technologies, creating new industries in support of what the state has got to get done. Right now, frankly, if you don't have that level of azimuth for these institutions of higher education, you're never going to collectively get to that point and that collective goal that we're striving for. And that's something that I think our state can uniquely do with our institutions of higher education to be able to focus on things like electrification of the grid, driving down the cost of EVs, and moving towards an electric vehicle future for the state of Maryland.
Boy, I hope everybody understands why we have endorsed Wes Moore. I could talk to him for a long time with lots of questions. Let me just put a highlight on this. We go through a very thorough process with questionnaires that are completed by candidates, interviews, multiple interviews. We had a debate that was across all gubernatorial candidates. And in the end, we endorse Wes Moore because we believe he is the best environmental candidate out there. He's clearly committed to improving the environment. The other thing is that he's smart about it. There's some candidates out there that might be pitching more aggressive goals or changing in dates. And I'm here to tell you that there's no way to get there. So Wes's policies are based on science. They're based on expertise. He has consulted with many people to get there. That's smart leadership. And so it's not only his commitment and his intellect about it and his science-based decision-making, but it's his leadership. And it's we strongly support his endorsement. We encourage everyone to vote for him. We encourage everybody to make a donation to his campaign and to our PAC, our Political Action Committee, where we can support Wes and other strong conservation candidates. There's a link in the chat on how to make that donation to our PAC. So we encourage that. So with the last minute or so. Wes, my question for you is, let everybody know why they should be voting for you.
Well, I think right now we have a chance to be bold as a state. And as I go around the state, the thing that I continue to hear from people is people are tired of both small politics and small policies. You know, they're tired of a seeming inability for us to be able to get big things done because we have people who are hunkered into their own corners. You know, and I know that in this time that we have a unique opportunity to be able to work across sectors, to be able to work across the state, to be able to work across political parties, frankly, to be able to address the needs that we continue to hear from people. You know, when Steny Hoyer, you know, endorsed our campaign, he said, you know, it's not just that I think that this campaign has a unique opportunity to win in November, because he said, I believe that, you know, that they understand how to both energize the base, but not alienate everybody else, which is how you win in November. But it's also to help drive us to a new future. And I believe deeply that this is going to be Maryland's decade. This is going to be our time to get this right. This is going to be our time to address the issue of the environment, to be able to address the issues of making sure we have a clean and healthy bay, and that the state should take leadership. And Maryland alone is not going to solve it, but Maryland must lead. And we must work in partnership with our neighbors to ensure that we have a clean and healthy bay, to ensure that we're addressing things like extreme heat islands, and then why we have certain children who are growing up in areas that are just chronically underinvested in, and they're seeing the distinct impacts of climate change. That we should be dealing with the issues of everything from the high levels of asthma to the issue of lead that we have not addressed. All of these are issues that I think we have a chance to move on, to be bold as a state. And I'm thankful for the fact, I'm thankful not just for the support, but I believe in partnership that this is our time to do this, to take this generational moment to create a generational change to these generational challenges. That this is our time to do it. And I know that in partnership, we're going to be able to get it done. And I think it's something we uniquely offer. And I'm thankful for that.
Ladies and gentlemen, Wes Moore, hopefully the next Maryland governor. Thank you, Wes. Thank you all for joining us. As always, it's a pleasure. We are going to have another webinar next week on our legislative scorecard that came out yesterday. Some pretty exciting news. So we look forward to seeing you in that discussion as well. Take care, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Take care. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kim.
Thanks, Wes.